The brain is divided into two halves, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. This is called lateralization, and it applies to any animal. In animals that are particularly vocal, such as canaries, dolphins, and chimpanzees, it seems that one hemisphere or another is dedicated to controlling those behaviors and the responses to them. Neural networks in the brain are established over time as an individual learns and experiences things. Language and speech skills are therefore acquired after birth. The human genome codes for the speech ability that will evolve as the brain is trained. In human beings, it is the left hemisphere that usually contains the specialized language areas. While this holds true for 97% of right-handed people, about 19% of left-handed people have their language areas in the right hemisphere, and as many as 68% of them have some language abilities in both the left and the right hemispheres. Most recently, researchers have taken advantage of the huge advances made in brain imaging. In particular, the PET scan known as positron emission tomography provides a computer with the information needed to construct a three-dimensional map of a person's brain, including the relative activity of different areas. PET scans involve injecting someone with a radioactive glucose solution. Since active areas of the brain use more energy, and therefore more glucose, they release more radiation, which the computer translates into warmer colors such as yellow and red. Areas that are less active are shown with cooler colors such as green and blue. As by now you should expect, certain areas of the left hemisphere were more active while people were engaged in linguistic activities. Speech and language brain regions. The visual cortex is the part of the cerebral cortex that is responsible for processing visual information. The auditory cortex in the cerebral cortex processes auditory information and as part of the sensory system for hearing performs both basic and higher hearing functions. Warnock's area is an area in the cerebral cortex related to speech and is involved in both spoken and written language. This area was named after Karl Warnock, a German neurologist who discovered that the area is related to how words and syllables are pronounced. Broca's area is an area in the frontal lobe of the brain that is related to the production of speech. The area is named after Pierre-Paul Broca, who noticed an impaired ability to produce speech in two patients who had sustained injury to the region. Broca's area is not just a matter of getting language out in a motor sense, though. It seems to be more generally involved in the ability to deal with grammar itself, at least the more complex aspects of grammar. For example, when they hear sentences that are put into a passive form, they often misunderstand. If you say the boy was slapped by the girl, they may understand you as communicating that the boy slapped the girl instead. Reading and writing are a part of language as well, of course. But since these skills have only been around a few thousand years, they are not as clearly marked in terms of brain functioning as the basic comprehension and production areas. But there is an area of the brain called the angular gyrus that lies about halfway between Warnock's area and the visual cortex of the occipital lobe. Broca's area is now typically defined in terms of the pars opercularis and pars triangularis of the inferior frontal gyrus, represented in Brodmann's cytoarchitectonic map as areas 44 and 45 of the dominant hemisphere. Studies of chronic aphasia have implicated an essential role of Broca's area in various speech and language functions. Further, fMRI studies have also identified activation patterns in Broca's area associated with various language tasks. Broca's area is usually formed by the pars triangularis and the pars opercularis of the inferior frontal gyrus. It follows Warnock's area, and as such they both are usually located in the left hemisphere of the brain. Broca's area is involved mostly in the production of speech. Given its proximity to the motor cortex, neurons from Broca's area send signals to the larynx, tongue and mouth motor areas, which in turn send the signals to the corresponding muscles, thus allowing the creation of sounds. Warnock's area. Warnock's area is classically located in the posterior section of the superior temporal gyrus of the dominant hemisphere, with some branches extending around the posterior section of the lateral sulcus, in the parietal lobe. Considering its position, Warnock's area is located relatively between the auditory cortex and the visual cortex. The former is located in the transverse temporal gyrus in the temporal lobe, while the latter is located in the posterior section of the occipital lobe. While the dominant hemisphere is in charge of most of language comprehension, recent studies have demonstrated that the less dominant homologous area participates in the comprehension of ambiguous words, whether they are written or heard. Receptive speech has traditionally been associated with Warnock's area of the posterior superior temporal gyrus and surrounding areas. Current models of speech perception include greater Warnock's area, but also implicate a dorsal stream that includes regions also involved in speech motor processing. Another recent finding has showed significant areas of activation in subcortical and neocortical areas during the production of communicative manual gestures and vocal signals in chimpanzees. Further, the data indicating that chimpanzees intentionally produce manual gestures as well as vocal signals to communicate with humans suggests that the precursors to human language are present at both the behavioral and neuroanatomical levels. More recently, the neocortical distribution of activity-dependent gene expression in marmosets provided direct evidence that the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which comprises Broca's area in humans and has been associated with auditory processing of species-specific vocalizations and orofacial control in macaques, is engaged during vocal output in a New World monkey. These findings putatively set the origin of vocalization-related neocortical circuits to at least 35 million years ago, when the Old and New World monkey lineages split. Language processing refers to the way humans use words to communicate ideas and feelings, and how such communications are processed and understood. Thus it is how the brain creates and understands language. Most recent theories consider that this process is carried out entirely by and inside the brain. This is considered one of the most characteristic abilities of the human species, perhaps the most characteristic. However, very little is known about it and there is huge scope for research on it. This part of the brain also enhances the way linguistic learners learn and think. Studies have shown that most of the language processing functions are carried out in the cerebral cortex. The essential function of the cortical language areas is symbolic representation. Even though language exists in different forms, all of them are based on symbolic representation. Much of the language function is processed in several association areas, and there are two well-identified areas that are considered vital for human communication: Warnock's area and Broca's area. These areas are usually located in the dominant hemisphere and are considered the most important areas for language processing. This is why language is considered a localized and lateralized function. Other factors are believed to be relevant to language processing and verbal fluency, such as cortical thickness, participation of prefrontal areas of the cortex, and communication between right and left hemispheres. The arcuate fasciculus is the area of the brain between Warnock's area and Broca's area that connects the two through bundles of nerve fibers. This portion of the brain serves as a transit center between the two areas, dealing most largely with speech and communication. Recent studies have shown that the rate of increase in raw vocabulary fluency was positively correlated with the rate of cortical thinning. In other words, greater performance improvements were associated with greater thinning. This is more evident in left hemisphere regions, including the left lateral dorsal frontal and left lateral parietal regions, the usual locations of Broca's area and Warnock's area, respectively. The strongest correlations between language fluency and cortical thicknesses were found in the temporal lobe and temporal parietal junction. Significant correlations were also found in the auditory cortex, the somatosensory cortex related to the organs responsible for speech, and frontal and parietal regions related to attention and performance monitoring. The frontal and parietal regions are also evident in the right hemisphere. Acoustic stimuli are received by the auditive organ and are converted to bioelectric signals on the organ of Corti. These electric impulses are then transported through Scarpa's ganglion to the primary auditory cortex, on both hemispheres. Each hemisphere treats it differently, nevertheless, while the left side recognizes distinctive parts such as phonemes, the right side takes over prosodic characteristics and melodic information. The signal is then transported to Warnock's area on the left hemisphere. The information that was being processed on the right hemisphere is able to cross through interhemispheric axons, where the already noted analysis takes part. During speech comprehension, activations are focused in and around Warnock's area. A large body of evidence supports a role for the posterior superior temporal gyrus in acoustic phonetic aspects of speech processing, whereas more ventral sides such as the posterior middle temporal gyrus, shortly known as PMDG, are thought to play a higher linguistic role, linking the auditory word form to broadly distributed semantic knowledge. Also, the PMDG site shows significant activation during the semantic association interval of the verb generation and picture naming tasks, In contrast to the PSTG sites that remain at or below baseline levels during this interval. This is consistent with a greater lexical semantic role for PMTG relative to a more acoustic phonetic role for PSTG. Early auditory processing and word recognition take place in inferior temporal areas of what pathway, where the signal arrives from the primary and secondary visual cortices. The representation of the object in the what pathway and nearby inferior temporal areas itself constitutes a major aspect of the conceptual semantic representation. Additional semantic and syntactic associations are also activated, and during this interval of highly variable duration depending on the subject, the difficulty of the current object, the word to be spoken is selected. This involves some of the same sites prefrontal cortex shortly known as PFC, supramarginal gyrus shortly known as SMG, and other association areas involved in the semantic selection stage of verb generation. From Warnock's area, the signal is taken to Broca's area through the Arcuate Fasciculus. Speech production activations begin prior to verbal response in the perirhallandic cortices. The role of ventral perirhallandic cortices in speech motor functions has long been appreciated in Broca's area. The superior portion of the ventral premotor cortex also exhibited auditory responses preferential to speech stimuli and are part of the dorsal stream. Involvement of Warnock's area in speech production has been suggested, and recent studies document the participation of traditional Warnock's area only in post-response auditory feedback, while demonstrating a clear pre-response activation from the nearby temporal parietal junction shortly known as TPJ. It is believed that the common route to speech production is through verbal and phonological working memory using the same dorsal stream implicated in speech perception and phonological working memory. The observed pre-response activations at these dorsal stream sites are suggested to subserve phonological encoding and its translation to the articulatory score for speech. Post-response Warnock's activations, on the other hand, are involved strictly in auditory self-monitoring. Several authors support a model in which the route to speech production runs essentially in reverse of speech perception, as in going from conceptual level to word form to phonological representation. Team of researchers reported that monkeys have a vocal tract capable of human speech. They argue that other primates can't talk because they lack the right wiring in their brains. A monkey's vocal tract would be perfectly adequate to produce hundreds, thousands of words, said Tecumseh Fitch, a cognitive scientist at the University of Vienna and a co-author of the new study. Human speech results from a complicated choreography of flowing air and contracting muscles. To make a particular sound, we have to give the vocal tract a particular shape. The vocal tracts of other primates contain the same elements as ours, from vocal cords to tongues to lips, but their geometry is different. They used acoustic formulas to determine what sort of sound the tract would produce. Then they tested out variations on that shape, based on how living monkeys open their jaws and move other parts of their vocal tracts. In collaboration with Asife Gazanfr, a neuroscientist at Princeton, Dr. Fitch filmed 3 rhesus macaque monkeys with a portable X-ray scanner. The goal was to survey the range of sounds monkeys will make on their own. We only wanted them to do their natural capabilities, said Dr. Gazanfr. When the scientists brought another monkey into the room, for example, the animals would smack their lips. The scientists could get the monkeys to coo and grunt when presented with fruit. As they ate the fruit, the video showed, the monkeys moved their mouths and throats into alternate positions. The scientists selected 99 stills from their X-ray videos to study in more detail. They mapped the outline of the vocal tract in each picture, and then generated a 3-dimensional computer rendering of it, which they then used to model the sounds that a monkey could make by pushing air through that space. In theory, the researchers concluded, monkeys can make a fairly wide range of sounds. Looking at the most distinct vocal tract shapes, Dr. Fitch and Dr. Gazanfr identified 5 separate vowels among the possibilities. What you get are the vowels in bit, bet, bat, but and bot, Dr. Fitch said. When the researchers played these sounds to people, they were able to correctly distinguish them most of the time. The scientists could even assemble the sounds into recognizable sentences. So what prevents these monkeys from gabbing all day long by the watering hole? The 2 researchers argue that the key to the acquisition of speech lies somewhere in the brain. If they had the brain, they could produce intelligible speech, Dr. Gazanfr said. Our ancestors may have evolved special brain circuits that allowed them to learn new sounds as babies. Humans also developed a special set of nerves for the fine motor control of their vocal tracts. Dr. Lieberman isn't convinced. His view is still that the evolution of human speech had to involve changes in both the brain and the vocal tract. Monkeys in the new study, he noted, failed to make the most distinct sounds in human speech, such as a long E. Without such a full repertoire of distinct sounds, he argues, it's not possible to speak clearly as we do. It's the difference between having a very saturated color and a very pastel color, he said. The acoustic version of saturated colors would have been important for full-blown human speech, he said. While monkeys may not have the full range of human vowels, Dr. Barney said, their repertoire is a very good starting place for speech. Still, she cautioned that the new study left important questions about speech unresolved. Vowels are important to speech, for example, but so are consonants. What they've shown is that monkeys are vowel-ready, not speech-ready, Dr. Barney said. The brain is